are talking about the movie with a somewhat direct title, Dead Bride. And this one is directed by Francisco Piccone. And this is actually an Italian movie, but it is filmed in English. And it's a movie, I have to say, that has got me somewhat flummoxed about how to review it. Let me give you a synopsis and I'll explain why that is. Now, it focuses on a couple who have a young baby, and they essentially go to the wife's father's kind of home, his home, because he has died under mysterious circumstances, and now they kind of move into this large, quite nice looking but old and gothic looking home. And there seems to have been a history within this home of something going on, something otherworldly. And obviously, you know, we learn through the movie what that actually is. But obviously it doesn't take long before spooky things start to happen, menacing, particularly the wife who, you know, is obviously getting the brunt of it. But, you know, we find there is a supernatural entity in this kind of area, and we seek help from professionals in the church and kind of spirit mediums and things like this to hopefully combat this supernatural menace. On what will happen, you have to watch the movie to find out. So far, sounds so generic, you might be thinking. Why would I be so flummoxed to this? I'm going to kind of like tell you a little bit about my review before I even say it. This movie, on one hand, I think has some very strong elements, but it has two huge issues, one of which is not something I normally would complain about too much, but it's so blatant in this movie, it really has to be discussed. But let me talk about what I think works in this movie, because even though I'm going to hammer it with two major issues in a minute, there is good stuff to be said here, and it's pretty good. Number one, I think the spooky stuff that we see on screen is well handled. We get a decent amount of scares. I think that it has a good job in kind of building a kind of spooky atmosphere with, you know, a kind of a feeling of dread that kind of builds throughout the movie with some spooky kind of lighting, music and things like that. Good amount of pacing here. And actually, when we do see the more overt kind of supernatural stuff on screen, it's done to a good standard. I actually think the makeup, the effects, you know, for a relatively low budget movie, was actually pretty good. So the scares here, I feel, are well done. They are well done, they look good, they're well handled, and I think they're effective. The other thing I would say here as well is on a technical level, I think this movie, with the one exception, which I'm going to come on to, again, I mean, the lighting, cinematography, I think the camera work is pretty good here. You know, that you never really have any problems where I feel the editing is kind of like choppy or anything like that. It all feels kind of quite well put together on a technical level, with one exception, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But that's all kind of there. And the movie actually has a reasonable story. There's a little caveat with that. I'm going to come on to that in just a minute. But it does have a, you know, reasonable story, it has to be said. They're quite an intriguing kind of mystery. With some kind of somewhat interesting characters. So, what is the problem here? Well, let me tell you what I think is probably the lesser of the two problems, and then we're going to get into the big one. The lesser of the two major problems here is, as I've mentioned, this movie is an Italian-produced movie, but it is kind of it was kind of made with an English language. But the decision was made here, I think, probably because actors speaking their not native tongue, the dialogue was probably not all that good, not all that easy to understand. They have ADR'd it, and it sounds, the way it's been done, it sounds really fake. So we have this kind of, well, pretty much every single character through the entire movie, a complete redub of the dialogue, which it sounds kind of like the words are coming out the actor's mouth, and the performances aren't all that strong. Now, I don't know if it's the same actors that have done the same voice work, or if they just hired different actors. Maybe they because some of the actors sound like they're British, the voice actors. But even if it's the same actors, or if it's different actors to kind of appeal more to kind of like English-speaking kind of countries, it really sounds weird. It sounds so fake, you know, and kind of like unnatural kind of sounding, and not in a kind of spooky horror way, just in a kind of a weird kind of technical way. And the acting therefore also kind of feels really stilted, and the dialogue here, I have to say, the way it's delivered, some of it, the way it's written as well, is horrible. I mean, especially from the husband. The husband, I think, is the worst culprit here. But he's not alone. There are other kind of characters, and even the kind of the wife, who I feel gets away with some of it at least. You know, she has her kind of moments as well. But the dialogue here, both mainly in the way it's delivered, I would say, because of this horrible ADR job that they've done, which is where they redub the kind of the dialogue and kind of re-put it over the actual footage. But also the actual, some of the kind of what he said is kind of, it doesn't sound like it has been written with English in mind. It looks like it's basically been like a computer translation about what the English kind of like a translation would be, and therefore doesn't sound like proper grammar and things like this. So it kind of feels a little odd. Now, if that was the only problem, then I would say, whatever. You know, it's not the end of the world. I think outside of that, it's still quite a well-made film. But here's the real kicker. This movie is essentially a remake of Insidious, like an unofficial remake. Now, there's been movies that have clearly been inspired by other movies, and they kind of do their own take on it. My favourite movie of all time is Fright Night, and that's essentially a kind of a horror remake or a horror kind of version of Rear Window, but it has enough of its own elements, I think, to say it's not necessarily a straight remake. It's kind of a, you know, it takes that kind of basic idea and kind of like takes it one step further and does its own things with it. But this is more or less a kind of a straight remake. I mean, we've even got that kind of that classic kind of scare that was kind of behind Patrick Wilson. That's in there. Our antagonist is a kind of a ghostly bride. That's in there. We get the kind of the trip into the kind of like the ghost dimension. That's in there. We learn that this ghost bride has got a kind of, you know, this demonic kind of like force on her side. That's in there. Same as kind of like Insidious. We've got the kind of the psychic that kind of helps them and things like this. We've got the kind of the kidnapping and the kind of the child. That's it. It is all in there. And then, you know, it's a hard film to, because sometimes I review movies and say, well, that's kind of, it's a little bit of a rip-off of that film, but, you know, whatever. But this one, it's so blatant. It is so blatant. I feel it can't be ignored, you know. Again, I've reviewed films where I feel like it's kind of, you know, ripping off some parts of the movie, or it's clearly inspired by another movie, but you know, it's hard to think of another kind of movie which has been such a blatant kind of like, I mean, this has got a writing credit. Like, you haven't written this, mate. You just copied it off someone else. The writers probably think, haha, I found this really obscure movie called Insidious. I'm just going to copy it verbatim and no one will know. But it's like, so, it's pretty much just a straight remake, but with less money and delivered in a kind of like a horribly kind of written dialogue ADR kind of version of it. It seems like, why do it? You've got the technical elements here to make a pretty decent horror film, because it's actually filmed in a way which is well done. The effects are well done. The kind of the technical side of it is well done. Why not just kind of vary the story a little bit? Because it's just, you know, had it done that, it could have stood on its own as a kind of an interesting kind of horror movie. You might still have the ADR element, but nonetheless, at least it wouldn't be such a kind of a blatant rip-off. I mean, I really like the movie The Borderlands, and there was a movie called The Devil's Daughter, which kind of seemed like that was kind of a almost like a kind of unofficial remake of The Borderlands. But even that, it does pales in comparison to this one. And normally it's not something I would kind of really chastise the movie so much for, because it's whatever, you know, there's so many kind of stories you can tell. There's bound to be kind of similarities between some of them. But this one, it goes so far with it, I have to kind of like factor that in, because I just feel it's disingenuous to not kind of, you know, factor that into a kind of a score. Now, that being said, you know, I do think there is some enjoyment to be here. If you don't care that this is more or less a kind of a remake of Insidious, or you haven't seen Insidious, then you might, you know, you've still got that ADR element, I think. But yeah, it's worth a watch. But yeah, it's weird choices. Weird choices. So how to kind of review, to actually mark this movie? I would still say it's probably an above average movie in regards to You know, the way it's made, and the story is good, but it's been done before, you know. But I've got to kind of knock it down quite heavily because it's such a rip-off. So I'll give it a 6 out of 10, and I feel like, you know, I have to say it's probably an above average kind of B movie, but just above that mark, you know. I can't give it much higher than that because I just feel it's unfair. So yeah, an interesting little movie in some ways. And as I was going along, I was thinking, surely it's not going to do this. You know, it's already having similarities to Insidious, but it's not going to go do this. Yeah, it is going to do that. Oh, it's going to do that as well. Oh my God, it's literally the same. Weird. And what a weird title as well. Anyway, 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.